Hey guys, Abel here, back with another video. Long time no see. I wanted to do a much higher quality video on the topic that I'm about to talk about, but for a number of reasons, it didn't come together. So it's just gonna be me talking to you and telling you about my recent mini cut, which hopefully is going to be the first video out of a series of videos, all under the same theme, which is my recent body recomposition, which took place over the course of about 5 months. And the first stage of this was actually a bulk, which I'm gonna be talking about in a future video. But today I'm gonna be talking about the mini cut that took place after the bulk for about 5 weeks. And over the course of this mini cut, I lost about 5 kilograms or 11 pounds in about 5 weeks. And in this video, I'm gonna be telling you all the top 6, maybe 7, 8, I didn't count them up, strategies that helped me to get there. And maybe there will be some interesting takeaways for you guys as well. But just before we get into this, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe or hit that bell notification icon so that I don't have to make clickbaity thumbnails such as this one for YouTube to recommend my videos to you. And with that, let's jump into it. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I did a longer bulk, about 4-month long bulk before this cut. And I learned some interesting lessons about eating in a caloric surplus, how your training tolerance changes, and especially whether doing a more aggressive, assertive bulk, you could call it kind of a dreamer bulk, is worth it or not, because that's what I did. And I learned some interesting lessons about that. But again, that's a topic for another video. At the beginning of the cut and at the end of my bulk, I was at 92 kilos, which is definitely my heaviest ever body weight. I'm not a super big guy, and I don't think that I was this heavy ever, period. And it's pretty neat that at this point I still had some semblance of muscle definition and some abs, even though they were blurry, whereas earlier on, whenever I approached 90 kilos, I was just fat. So there is some improvement to speak of, definitely. And at the end of my cut, I was 87 kilos, and I would say I was around 12, maybe 13% body fat. And at this body fat percentage, this body weight for me is pretty good. I'm 6 foot tall, which is not small, but in reality, I'm really more like 5'10". I just have this really big head on top, which boosts my height to 6 foot. So for a 5'10" body frame size, 87 kilos at this body fat percentage is pretty neat if you ask me. Initially, I set out for myself that I would be in a calorie deficit for about 8 weeks, and I would simply try to lose as much fat as possible in that time frame. But the cut actually went so well that I was able to finish it in 5 weeks, which was pretty good. Now, if I had to estimate my body fat percentage at the beginning of the cut, I would say it was about 18% body fat, and I think that's a great place for many people to start cutting. You could push your bulk further and you could eat in a surplus until you reach maybe 20% body fat, 22% body fat. But I think many of you will find that after a couple of months of eating in a surplus, you will be kind of fed up with eating. I mean, eating is fun, sure, but it will just not be that exciting to keep eating a lot of food. And you will definitely not like what you're seeing in the mirror too much. So under eating will be a welcomed act for many of you, I think. Now, one thing that I really kept in mind during this cut is that I didn't want to stretch it out for too long. As I mentioned a bunch of times earlier, probably the biggest mistake that I made during my training career was under eating too much and not spending enough time in a calorie surplus. So I really wanted to make every day and every week of this cutting phase count. So I really set out to not screw around too much, be disciplined, and just not drag out this cut for longer than it really needs to be. Now, most people, when they start out with a cut, they usually set a predetermined calorie deficit for themselves. Maybe it's 500 calories per day, maybe it's 700 or 1,000 or 1,200 if they are really aggressive. Generally, losing anywhere between 0.5% to maybe 1% of your body weight per week is pretty good for most people. You could even push it up to 1.2% to 1.5% even when you're at the body fat level where I was at around 18%. Martin McDonald devised a pretty good model, which is simply taking your body fat percentage, dividing it by 15, and that is the percentage loss of body weight that you should be aiming for per week. Now, I myself have applied a different strategy, and that was to simply eat as little as I can based on my appetite. So each and every day, I was simply trying to minimize my calorie intake while making sure that I was not going insane from hunger. And what's neat about that is that this way, my calorie deficit was autoregulating itself based on my hunger levels, which was of course changing based on how much body fat I had. Because simply put, the fatter you are, the lower your hunger levels will be, and the bigger calorie deficit you can tolerate. So in the beginning, I was occasionally in an enormous calorie deficit, 1,000, 1,500, probably on some days even as big as 2,000 calories, which I could tolerate just fine in the beginning. And of course, as time has gone on and I was getting leaner, my calorie deficit got smaller and smaller. And at the end, probably the biggest calorie deficit I was in on any given day was maybe 1,000, but typically more like 500 to 700 calories per day. Now, this brings us to the next point, which is food choices, which is definitely the biggest component of any successful fat loss phase, especially if you are cutting aggressively. I simply took the foods that I was eating in my meals and I replaced them with lower calorie variants. So instead of things like oatmeal, I started eating strawberries or other low calorie fruits, which is like a 10th-fold calorie reduction. Instead of starchy plant foods like potatoes or corn, I started eating fibrous veggies, and some of the full fat protein sources got replaced by leaner variants. And this way I was able to cut a lot of calories without having to struggle with a lot of hunger, because I kept the volume of my overall diet the same, or it even increased over the course of the diet. I largely kept the structure of my diet the same. So during my bulk, I ate 3 or 4 meals most days, and that is my general recommendation for most people, eating 3 or 4 meals a day. And 4 meals tends to work better when you're bulking, and stuffing all your calories into 3 meals might be a bit uncomfortable. And then 3 meals tend to work better when your calories might be really low, and distributing them over even as much as 4 meals might make your individual meals just annoyingly small. So for the most part, during this cut, I stuck to 3 meals. And it's really good to have a solid diet structure down by the time you start out with your diet, because having a really frantic meal schedule when you're eating your meals at completely random times just sets you up for random hunger pangs, which is really the last thing you need when you're already on a low calorie diet. In terms of training, I made a couple of prudent modifications to make my diet a bit safer and more viable for a low calorie diet. So I lowered my training volume a little bit, simply because before I started out with my diet, I was doing a lot of volume in the gym. I was close to 30 sets per week for most of my muscle groups. So I went down to about 20, which is a pretty big, like 30% reduction in volume. Most of you guys will probably not need to reduce your volume by that much. If you're doing a moderate amount of volume, so maybe 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week, maybe lowering it by 10% is more than enough. And if you're doing anything less than 10 sets, you probably don't even need to reduce your volume at all. Now, where I did make modifications is in the rep ranges. So for the most part during this cut, I was prioritizing or favoring higher rep ranges. And it's not because higher reps will get you ripped or they will improve muscle definition. It is simply because lighter loads and higher reps are more sparing on the joints. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that I doubled my rep target in all of my sets. It simply meant increasing my rep target a little bit. So maybe by 2 to 4 reps on average. So if earlier I was doing 5 reps on an exercise, maybe now I was doing 8 reps. Or if earlier I was doing 8 reps, now I did 12. And of course, if my reps were already pretty high to begin with, so 12 to 15 or higher, then I didn't necessarily make changes just for the sake of making changes. The next thing is repetition tempo. Now, controlled reps are a good idea anyway and is recommended anyway, but I really made sure that I really controlled my reps, and the negative portion of my reps was about 2 to 4 reps for most lifts. And I employed a complete zero tolerance policy for any kind of cheating or body momentum, especially on full body compound lifts. This brings me to the next point, which is slightly shifting the focus of my training sessions. So we all know that progressive overload is king, or at least one of the kings for effective training stimulus. But instead of solely focusing on hitting PRs and focusing on the weight and the reps, I really kept a couple of things in mind for my training in general. So I kept in mind my overall weekly training volume, and I was pretty flexible with how I was getting that in. So I was flexible with exercise selection and the sequencing of my exercises. So if one day I was planning to do heavy chin-ups, but then my elbows were a bit sore from the previous day, I had no problem replacing those chin-ups with some straight arm pull-downs for sets of 20, and then some occluded bicep curls for sets of 30. So that's one thing I kept in mind, and the other one was intensity of effort or reps in reserve. So as long as I had 1 or 2 reps in the tank on all sets, I didn't really worry about how many reps I got and where my weights were falling. So as long as I pushed sufficiently close to failure, I knew that I recruited most of my muscle fibers and that I got in the effective training stimulus I was looking for. And I didn't stress too much about the weight and the reps. The next thing is cardio. Now, cardio is helpful when you're pretty sedentary and you just don't burn a lot of calories in your day-to-day life. Luckily, I got into the habit a long time ago of commuting by foot. So I'm fairly active and I get in at least 7,000 steps per day, but typically more like 10,000 to 15,000. But luckily, I got into another good habit, which is doing about 5 to maybe 15 minutes of incline walking before and after my training sessions, which is a good idea when maybe the weather goes to shit or maybe you just don't walk around as much for whatever reason. And for those times, you already have the habit down of getting on that treadmill, and it's just a matter of how much you're walking. And with this added habit, it's pretty easy for me to get in at least like 15,000 steps each and every day. And near the end of this cut, I increased my daily steps this way to about 20,000. So that allowed me to eat a bit more food and to not have to drop my calories so crazy low to keep losing at the pace that I wanted to lose. Now, the last thing I want to quickly touch on is the mindset that goes into this whole thing, because dieting, and especially a more rapid fat loss phase, is 80%, maybe even 90% a mental game. I mean, really, from a strategic perspective, setting up the diet properly, determining your calorie deficit, determining the optimal rate of weekly weight loss is really, really simple. I mean, honestly, a chimpanzee could do it. What is tough is actually sticking to the diet and persevering until the end and having the right mindset so that you don't quit, don't cheat on your diet, don't fuck around too much and drag out the whole process way longer than it needs to be, and get stuff done effectively. That is the hard part. So I want to say something about this as well. And if I had to put this whole thing into one word, it would be embracing the suck. Really, there are a lot of things you can do to manage your hunger, make sure that you can fall asleep at night properly, make sure that you have proper energy during the day, even on low calories. We can talk about a lot of these things. But what we have to accept when we are trying to lose fat fast is that this is not going to be a time when we will have a ton of fun with food. Really, this is not going to be the time when we will go out and have awesome meals in restaurants. This is not going to be the time when we are going to explore the most awesome recipes and eat super tasty foods, even super tasty low-calorie foods. In general, this is going to be a time when the hedonic pleasure on a day-to-day basis is not going to come from the act of eating. And it sounds simple, but I think many people have a tough time embracing this concept, because I see a lot of people employing things like diet breaks, refeeds, trying to fit in eating out, and I really do think that all of those things have a place. But I think that most people employ this with the wrong mindset, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to make something that is inherently uncomfortable comfortable. They diet for 2 weeks, the going gets hard a little bit, they have their first craving, maybe they get hungry a little bit, and it's like, oh my God, my body is freaking out, I need a refeed. No, you're trying to lose fat fast. That is just part of the game. And guess what? If it is too hard, if you can't deal with the cravings, if you are really intent on eating out during this period, look, you don't have to lose fat fast. You can settle for something that is slower, a bit more sustainable, and you can fit in all these things into your lifestyle. But I think it's important to get clear on what you want and also on what you're willing to give up. And it's okay if you're not willing to give up certain things, but then you have to come to terms with the fact that you're not gonna get these specific results either. There is a level of stoicism that goes into this whole thing. You have to embrace the suck, embrace the temporary discomfort, and get into a mindset where food and the hedonic pleasure you're getting from food is just not the center of your attention. And you're settling for this lifestyle for this period of time, and then when it's over, maybe you can go back to enjoying the day-to-day pleasures of eating on a more regular basis. Now, if you're curious on more detail about this whole thing, there is a couple of resources that I'm going to link in the show description. There is a longer podcast episode I recorded on this, and there is also an article I wrote, so you can check all of those out, and I'm talking about these things in more detail. But this is a shorter video that I recorded for you. Hopefully, you were able to take away some lessons from all of this. But yeah, all in all, I lost 5 kilos in 5 weeks, or about 11 pounds in 5 weeks. I went down to about 87 kilos at 12 to 13% body fat. And it was very simple. This is how I did it. And this was the strategy I employed, simply eating as little as I could while managing satiety. And I believe that this is perhaps the most ruthlessly effective and efficient way of doing it. And that's why I created an entire course about this called the Autoregulatory Eating Course. Shameless plug. Sorry. So yeah, guys, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Let me know if you enjoy this shorter format. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section. And with that, see you next time.